There is a part of you that you have spent your entire life trying to bury, not out of malice, but because the world taught you it was too dangerous to exist, and the more you pushed it down, the more it grew in the dark, shaping your decisions, sabotaging your achievements, and silently controlling every relationship you destroyed without ever understanding why. Carl Jung spent decades studying this phenomenon, and what he discovered about the nature of the male psyche will change, in an irreversible way, how you see yourself. Before anything else, answer me something in the comments right now. What is the quality you hate most in other people? Arrogance, weakness, dishonesty, neediness, whatever it is. Write that answer down. Because by the end of this video, it's going to reveal something about you that you've probably never admitted out loud, and that will make far more sense than you expect. Most men spend their entire lives believing that growth means becoming better, eliminating flaws, controlling impulses, building a solid and consistent image for the world. You learn early on to suppress what isn't acceptable, to moderate what seems excessive, to hide what feels weak or shameful. And as you do this, you convince yourself you're maturing, that you're becoming more disciplined, more controlled, more self-possessed. But Jung discovered that this mission, as noble as it appears on the surface, is precisely what prevents a man from finding his deepest purpose. Because everything you reject in yourself doesn't disappear. It sinks. It descends into a layer of your psyche where you can no longer see it consciously, but where it keeps acting, influencing, leaking through the edges of your life in ways you cannot explain. Jung called this repository of everything that was rejected the shadow. And understanding what it is, what it holds, and what it wants from you is the beginning of the only journey that truly matters for a man. But here is where it gets unsettling, and where most men would rather not go. Because the shadow doesn't sit still and wait. It grows. And when it grows large enough, it doesn't ask for permission to act. From childhood, you learned what you're allowed to feel and what must be suppressed. Too much anger, dangerous. Raw ambition, arrogance. Intense desire, shameful. Fear, weakness. Grief, cowardice. And so, piece by piece, year after year, you built a presentable version of yourself, a persona, as Jung called it, and pushed everything else into the basement. The problem isn't that you did this. Any man raised within a society did the same. The problem is believing that what went into the basement stayed inert. The shadow is not passive. It is a living part of your psyche, with energy, with intention, with a voice of its own. And what most people fail to understand about it is that it doesn't only carry what is dark in you. It also carries your purest intensity, your capacity for leadership, your effortless ability to attract, your natural aggressiveness that, when directed, builds empires. Jung said this plainly. In the shadow, there is 90% pure gold. Everything society taught you to control, to moderate, to hide, it's there, stored, full of potential, waiting for you to have the courage to go down and claim it. Have you ever acted in a way you didn't recognize in yourself? An outburst you didn't see coming? A decision that seemed to come from somewhere else? A reaction you couldn't explain even to yourself afterward? Comment below. A simple yes tells me everything I need to know, because that moment has a name, and now you're going to understand where it comes from. Because there is a pattern in the men who collapse, in the ones who reach the top and fall apart, in the ones who self-sabotage exactly when they were closest to everything they wanted. And that pattern has everything to do with what Jung discovered about the unintegrated shadow. Think of the men you've watched reach the top and crash in ways no one could quite explain. The high-performing executive who destroyed a decades-long marriage on a single night of impulse. The disciplined, composed, widely admired man who one day exploded in a way so disproportionate that everyone around him was left speechless. The guy who seemed to have everything under control and suddenly acted in a way that completely contradicted everything he claimed to be. Jung would explain each of these collapses with clinical precision. The unintegrated shadow doesn't fade with time. It pressurizes. The more you ignore it, the more you build a rigid and impeccable persona on top of it, the more pressure accumulates in the basement. And there comes a moment, a trigger, a stress, a limit that's been crossed, where the pressure is too great, and what had been stored rises with a force that respects nothing you've built. This is not moral weakness. This is not a lack of character. It is basic psychology. It is the natural functioning of a psyche that has been divided, that has been forced to be half of itself for too long. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations about self-knowledge, as the highest discipline a man can cultivate, not because it was an abstract philosophical exercise, but because he knew in the practice of governing an empire that the man who does not know himself deeply is governed by forces he does not understand. The shadow is exactly that, an internal force that, when ignored, commands you in the moments when you needed most to be in control. Think of a decision you made, or a reaction you had, that you still cannot fully explain to yourself, a moment when you acted against what you believed, against what you wanted, against who you thought you were. That was the moment your shadow spoke louder than you. And if you've never stopped to understand what it was saying, it will keep speaking, at the least convenient moments possible. So what do? Do you fight it with more discipline, more willpower, more control? No. And here is the answer that goes against everything you've been taught about being a man, and that is at the same time the most powerful thing Jung ever left us. Jung was absolutely clear about this. You don't defeat the shadow by fighting it. You integrate it. And integrating doesn't mean surrendering to the worst of yourself, doesn't mean letting rage explode because it's your nature, doesn't mean justifying every destructive impulse with philosophy. Integration means looking at what's in the basement, without fleeing, without judging, without rushing to cover it back up, and asking with an honesty that hurts, what is this part of me trying to tell me? Because every emotion that disturbs you is a message. Your anger is not just destruction. It's a signal that a boundary was violated, that something in your life is wrong and needs to change now, that there is a line you drew for yourself and someone crossed it without respect. A man who integrates his anger doesn't explode at the wrong moment with the wrong person. He identifies the injustice with precision and acts surgically. Your envy is not weakness. It is a treasure map pointing directly at what you desire most intensely and were afraid to admit you wanted. The man who looks at his own envy without shame discovers, almost always, the life project he had been avoiding out of fear of failure or judgment. Your undirected desire is not a character flaw. It is vital energy being wasted in draft form, power that could be building, creating, attracting, but that circulates without direction because no one ever taught you it is a resource, not a problem. The man who integrates the shadow doesn't just become better morally, he becomes more complete, more whole, more real. And it is exactly this wholeness that creates what people call presence, that magnetic quality you sense in certain men but cannot put into words. If this content is opening something in you, a doubt, a discomfort, a recognition, hit the like button now, not for the algorithm, as a signal to yourself that this knowledge matters and that you've chosen to take it seriously. And stay here, because what comes next connects all of this to something most men have never related to Jung, because there is a direct and devastatingly honest connection between the integrated shadow and a man's real power of attraction. And it is going to fundamentally contradict everything you've ever been taught about seduction, masculine presence, and what women actually feel. The most magnetic men you've ever encountered, the ones whose entrance into a room subtly shifts the atmosphere, the ones people naturally stop to listen to when they speak, the ones who attract without apparent effort and without visible technique, are not the ones with the most self-control. They're not the ones who read the most books on seduction, not the ones who mastered the most communication tactics, not necessarily the most handsome or the wealthiest. They are the ones who know themselves most deeply. Real presence, the kind you feel before you can analyze it, doesn't come from performance. It comes from a man who went down into the basement of his own psyche, looked at what was stored there without blinking, and returned to the surface without hidden fragments, without energy being spent to maintain facades, without the constant internal tension between who he is and who he pretends to be. This creates a solidity that no technique can replicate because it is genuine. It comes from depth. Women sense the unintegrated shadow in a man before he even opens his mouth. They sense the tension between the persona he projects and what is buried underneath. They sense when a man is afraid of himself. And that fear, no matter how well disguised with surface-level confidence, creates an inconsistency that repels exactly what that man most wants to attract. On the other hand, the man who has become whole, in Jung's vocabulary, the man who has gone through the process of individuation, carries an authority that needs no external validation, a calm that is not the absence of emotion, but mastery over it, and an attraction that operates on a level that goes far beyond appearance or conversation. He doesn't need to impress, because he has nothing hidden that needs compensating for. He simply is, and that simply being holds more power than years of accumulated technique. Answer this honestly, and you can just answer it to yourself. You don't need to comment. Are you living as the man you truly are, or as the man you learned you needed to be in order to be accepted? That gap between the two, that space between who you are and who you perform being, is exactly where the shadow lives. And it is exactly where your work begins. But knowing this isn't enough. Understanding the theory moves nothing. What transforms a man is not the knowledge, it's what he does with it every single day. And this is where Stoicism enters as the most powerful complement that Jungian philosophy could ever have. The confrontation with the shadow is not an event. It is a daily, deliberate, and often uncomfortable practice. And the Stoics understood this centuries before Jung was born. Marcus Aurelius didn't write his meditations to publish them. He wrote them for himself every night, as a brutal exercise in self-examination, looking at where he had failed, where he had acted on impulse, where the shadow had spoken louder than reason. Not because he was weak, because he was wise enough to know that a man's greatest enemy does not stand outside him. The practice that Jung and the Stoics converge on is this: every day in silence you observe, what disturbed me today with disproportionate intensity? What awakened inexplicable envy? What triggered anger that went beyond the event? What aroused a desire I don't want to admit I have? Each of those reactions is a point on the map of your shadow, not to judge yourself. Judgment closes perception, but to map with cold clarity the internal territory you still don't know. And then, and here is where the real work happens, you transmute. The anger that surfaced you direct toward training, toward building something, toward the action that resolves the real problem that created it. The envy you convert into a goal written clearly on paper, because it revealed what you want and haven't yet pursued. The undirected desire you channel into presence, into focus, into the energy the people around you will sense without knowing where it comes from. This is not suppression. This is not control in the sense of suffocating. This is refinement, taking the raw material of the shadow and forging something with it. It is exactly what a blacksmith does with metal. He doesn't discard it because it's too hot. He puts it in the right fire, strikes at the right moment, and produces something that lasts forever. If you made it this far, you're already at a different level of commitment to your own growth. Subscribe, because there is no shallow content here, no hollow stage motivation that fades in 24 hours. There is real philosophy applied to the real life of a man who has decided to become whole. Now close the circle with the answer you held onto from the beginning, the quality you hate most in other people. Jung called this mechanism projection. We tend to see in others, with disproportionate intensity, exactly what we carry in our own shadow and refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. The dishonesty that irritates you in someone may be the reflection of moments when you were dishonest with yourself and never stopped to look. The arrogance that bothers you may be the echo of an ambition you suffocated out of fear of being too much. The weakness you despise may be the mirror of vulnerabilities you buried so deep you forgot they exist. This is not an accusation. It is a compass. It is the shadow trying through the window of others to show you what it holds. The man who can look at that mirror without fleeing, without defending himself, without condemning himself, simply observing with the clarity of a Stoic and the courage of someone who truly wants to know himself, that man no longer needs external approval to exist. He doesn't need performance. He doesn't need to prove anything. He simply is who he is, with everything that includes, and that wholeness is, at the same time, the source of his deepest purpose and his most powerful presence. Your shadow is not your enemy. It never was. It is the raw material of the man you haven't yet had the courage to be entirely, and now you know where he is. Now tell me in the comments, what was the quality you wrote down at the beginning? I want to reply to you with what Jungian philosophy says about what it reveals, because every answer you leave here will be different, each one pointing to a different shadow, a different purpose, a different man trying to become whole. It starts here.